Now, let us take a look at this recent headline from earlier in the month from The Telegraph. It says, Angela Rayner to set rules on Islam and free speech. It's saying that she is setting up an advisory council to come up with a definition of Islamophobia. The Telegraph is reporting that it's going to be headed up by the former Tory MP Dominic Grieve. But this is about government efforts to come up with an official definition of Islamophobia. Sajeeda, do we need one?
Yes, we do. And it's not unusual because we have in government at the moment a definition, for example, to deal with other forms of racism like anti-Semitism. And what's important, I think, for us to say is that this definition, the Islamophobia definition, like the IHRA definition on anti-Semitism, is a non-legally binding working definition. Those words are important. What that means is this is not about prosecuting people. This is actually about judging institutions by behaviours within those institutions and trying to implement culture change. It's also a working definition like the IHRA anti-Semitism definition, which basically means it will continue to change as society continues to change. The APPG definition of Islamophobia, of which I was involved with.
That's the all-party parliamentary group.
All-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, the definition that I was involved with and Dominic Grieve was involved with as well, was adopted by the Labour Party, by the Liberal Democrats, indeed by the Conservative Party in Scotland. My colleagues in the Conservative Party in Westminster did not adopt it. And I think this is the first stage. What that definition will look like is very much up to what the Deputy Prime Minister, where she wants to take it. Even as a member of the APPG, I'm not entirely wedded to that definition, just like Runnymede are not entirely wedded to their definition. This is about bringing together the work that's already been done in the Runnymede Trust, in the All-Party Parliamentary Group and others, to basically say it's time to say to a community of 4 million, 6% of our nation, that actually you do deserve to be of equal worth and value and to be protected, and for institutions, particularly public institutions, to know what the parameters are of this new and pernicious form of racism.
OK, well, you mentioned the APPG definition of Islamophobia. I'll just read it out. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. You said you were open to that being changed. What would you change about that?
I think it's a good definition, and I think if the government were to adopt that definition in its entirety, with all the explanatory notes that go with it, then I think that would be a start. But I'm also open to the fact that what is important here is that this community feel protected and feel that certainly in the workplace they are of equal worth and value, and that this new form of racism, and it is a pernicious form of racism, is recognised and understood. I think much of the debates about the definition have been really straw men arguments. Oh, it's about blasphemy. Well, no, it's not, because it's not about changing the law, and it's not about protecting Islam or protecting a religion or any religion. It's about protecting people who are believers or perceived to be believers. I mean, what's interesting in this country is that a lot of Islamophobic attacks are not actually directed at Muslims. They're often directed at Sikhs or people with turbans who are perceived to be Muslims, or attacks on gurdwaras because they're perceived to be mosques. You know, the thing about most racists is that they're also not very bright people. So I think it's really important for us to say that these straw men arguments that are being put up, unfortunately, by certain think tanks, including organisations like Policy Exchange, need to be dismissed. And what's important for the government to do is to look at how the community deserves something that allows them to be protected.
OK, well, some of the criticisms of a definition of Islamophobia is that it is too broad and would basically suppress criticism. Matthew, do you think we need a definition, an official definition? And if so, is that one that I read out from the APPG the one?
The definition needs to be narrow, and the key thing is the interpretation. I totally respect Saeeda's right to believe in Islam, and I'm sure you would defend my right to say that it's a belief in a fictional deity in the sky that we should be able to mock and laugh at in the same way that we can laugh us atheists at Christians and other ideologies that have caused great damage to our world. I've just come back from the Middle East. Religion is at the heart of this terrible tragedy that's unfolding there, as it has been in many other places. And I want to be able to see, like the Book of Mormon, a wonderful satire on a particular variant of a religion. And what I loved about this particular artistic endeavour is that the programme of the first ever showing of the Book of Mormon, the Mormons took out an ad saying, look, if you disagree with this, come and meet us. They didn't feel they needed to intimidate these people. They recognised that in a liberal society, people have a right to offend other people for their religious beliefs, even if they're precious to them. That is how cultural evolution, how societies change and benefit. And I worry a lot that there is, I think, a sense of cultural intimidation. I doubt that, I don't know if you'd agree, that something as satirical about Islam would have easily been made into a big West End production.
I mean, I agree with almost everything that you've said. And what's fascinating is that if you look at what Kenneth Stern, who was one of the original architects of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, says, he actually worked on that definition and then said, but I'm also concerned about certain organisations, including governments, adopting it because it has been weaponised by extremist Israelis. And that there will always be a weaponisation of a definition to pursue political ends. Could that definition be weaponised? Of course it could. Is the IHRA definition weaponised? Of course it is. But what we must have is in this country one consistency of treatment between different forms of racism and prejudice. What we must also have is non-legally binding spaces, places, definitions where we can start to talk about this form of racism. Look at the statistics. I mean, nobody can doubt after what happened in the summer and the 70% rise that we've seen of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobic attacks simply over the last 12 months that were reported only last week. There is no doubt this is a real and growing issue, and government, I am pleased, is taking it seriously. And certainly I know that there are many people across the political divide who are wanting to work collaboratively with government to make sure we come forward with something that doesn't suppress free speech, free debate, satire, comedy, discussion, all of those things, but also protects Muslim communities in this country.
Right, I mean, Peter, do we need the definition in order to be able to tackle anti-Muslim hatred?
Of course, you can't tackle something when you can't even define it. And that's why, you know, in 2016, when the then Conservative government came forward with a definition of anti-Semitism after a rise in anti-Semitic attacks, they were absolutely right to do so. This shouldn't be controversial. We just heard a great example there of a respectful discussion between two people who have different religious beliefs, but nevertheless both agree that, you know, incitement of violence against Muslims should have no place in British society. That's the kind of discussion we should be having, not cheap attacks from the leader of the opposition or others who demean their office when they simplify a complex but important issue down to a cheap political point-scoring exercise.
Right, I mean, Harriet, Kemi Badenoch has talked about this being a route to introduce blasphemy laws through the back door. Peter saying it shouldn't be controversial.
Well, I think you've got to keep as the fundamental principles, and we've had exactly that in this discussion here today, the great leadership in our country in terms of freedom of religion and belief, not just in the UK but around the world, and also freedom of speech. And so personally, I prefer the word anti-Muslim hatred because I think, as Sajeeda acknowledged, you don't want to have something that confuses in minds of people who might have racist behaviours, a religious belief and racial characteristics. So I think that's where the care needs to be brought to this, just as you get people calling out when people are anti-Semitic, when in fact they should be disagreeing with some of the actions of the Israeli government. And so it's really important to be careful in this area, but to make sure that the things that make the UK so special in terms of freedom of religion and belief and freedom of speech are not threatened.
Right, I mean, you say to be careful in this area, but your leader is talking about this being a way to introduce blasphemy laws through the back door. I mean, do you disagree with that?
I think what she's highlighting there is that the risk that of it being potentially an area where that might happen, and to be careful that we don't allow that to happen.
OK, I mean, Sajeeda...
Man argument,
OK,
right?
well, what about the idea of calling it anti-Muslim hatred rather than Islamophobia? I mean, focusing on the people rather than
Well, it's
religion.
anti-Muslim racism. Like whether you call it Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, you know, I call it pink bananas as far as I'm bothered about, you know, the kind of term. These are straw man arguments. We have spent a decade talking about the word, and all the while anti-Muslim racism is on the increase. More Muslims are facing hatred, aggression, violence, you know, microaggressions in the workplace. This is happening on a daily basis. And I think, you know, like I said in my book recently, I'm done. I'm done with trying to explain and caveat and justify and try and explain and educate people on these issues. We are talking here about the lived experiences of people. You know, my family, my father who came here, worked in the mills, helped build this country. My grandfathers who came to, having served in the British Indian Army, having defended this country. We're talking about my child who's back in the military, in the armed forces, in uniform. We're talking about their everyday lived experiences where there are people in this country, including tragically, in our politics, who are consistently sending out this message that you do not belong, you do not matter, you are different, you are other, you are going to be held to higher standards than everybody else. It has to stop.
Matthew, you wanted to come back.
Well, I am half Pakistani, half Welsh. It's quite an unusual combination. My dad came here from Pakistan to study law, met my mum. And so I experienced a lot of racism growing up in the 70s and 80s. You know, the P word was used not just by students, but by the teachers. And the National Front at the football stadiums giving out leaflets. I never could support. I'm going to Brentford tonight. It's wonderful these days at football. But back then, the P word, the N word was endemic. So I'm really pleased with how society has broadly in this country become, I think, tolerant and willing to judge people on the basis of their characteristics and character rather than their colour or anything arbitrary. But having said that, I think there's been a couple of things. Identity politics has been a disaster. Trying to define ourselves through narrow identity groups where there's apparently no bridge to the experiences of other people in different verticals. I think that's been really bad. And I'm worried about an uplift in, for example, the Tommy Robinson, who has criticised Islam and all Muslims. This is a very various group. There are some moderates. The Islamists, I think, are a massive danger to this country and to the wider world. These are the fundamentalists. I want to go after those people. But tarnishing everybody according to a single label is just deeply irrational.
But isn't that exactly what a definition of Islamophobia is trying to stop? It's tarnishing all Muslims.
On how it's used and how it's interpreted. I think it needs to be narrow and it needs to be interpreted in the way that protects the great liberal traditions of free speech.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point to make. Look, if you weaponize a religion, if you effectively politicize a religion, whether that's Islamism or Zionism, political ideologies do not need protection. But what we do need is we need to protect people who are believers or perceived to be believers. What's fascinating, actually, is that, interestingly, that, you know, many people who are attacked on our streets are from different religions. You know, some of the most vicious attacks in this country, anti-Muslim hatred attacks, aren't against Muslims. So this isn't actually about just protecting a religious community, and it's certainly not about protecting a religion. It's about creating a level playing field where everybody in this country feels like they're of equal worth and value.
OK.